It was a busy morning downtown, people rushing with coffee cups and fresh bread in their hands. Outside a popular bakery stood a man, calm and relaxed, scrolling through his phone with a pastry bag in one hand. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another customer enjoying the morning. But two officers driving past saw him differently. A call had just come over the radio about a black male in a navy jacket suspected in a break-in. That was all they needed. Without sirens, without questions, they pulled their car to the curb. One officer jumped out and shouted, "Hands where I can see them!" The man looked up, startled but calm. "I'm waiting for my driver," he replied, puzzled. But his explanation didn't matter. In seconds, his arm was twisted, cuffs were clamped around his wrists, and he was pushed into the back of the patrol car. People stopped to watch, phones raised, recording everything. The man stayed quiet, his silence steady, almost unsettling. He didn't look scared. He looked like someone who already knew something the officers didn't. At the station, the officers laughed and treated it like another routine arrest. They didn't bother to check his ID or look inside the bag he carried. They thought the paperwork would be easy. But as the man sat in the holding cell, he asked for one simple thing: his phone call. His voice was calm, almost professional. When he dialed, he didn't call a family member or a lawyer. He called a state office, his words short and serious. The call lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to make the desk officer nearby check his information. What he saw on the screen made him freeze. Something about this man was different, and the officers who arrested him had no idea how deep they were in. By afternoon, everything changed. An official email arrived at the precinct from the state's Civil Oversight Department. The message was clear: release the man immediately. No delays, no excuses. Within the hour, 2 officials in suits arrived and walked him out. He was free, not in cuffs, and he left with the same quiet calm he had outside the bakery. The 2 officers stood frozen, their confidence shaken. How could a so-called suspect walk out with that kind of authority behind him? Rumors began to spread through the department. Who exactly was this man, and why did the higher-ups move so quickly for him? Days later, the officers walked into court expecting to testify against him. They thought it would be simple. Uniforms on, charges read, another case closed. But when they stepped inside the courtroom, their stomachs sank. Sitting at the front table wasn't a defendant waiting for judgment. It was the same man, dressed in a tailored suit, calmly flipping through a binder. A nameplate in front of him read, "Special Counsel for Civil Accountability." He wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to review them. The judge called the room to order and announced that the case was not about theft, but about misconduct during an arrest. The officers realized in an instant that this was no longer about one bad call on a busy street. Over the next days, a review hearing opened. One by one, the man laid out files and reports. He showed a pattern: vague descriptions, rushed arrests, and repeated targeting of the same neighborhoods. Witnesses came forward, civilians who had been stopped and humiliated for nothing. One spoke about being pulled over for a broken tail light and leaving with a sprained wrist. Another told how he was thrown down in front of his daughter because he fit the description. Their stories weren't shouted. They were spoken simply, but each word cut deeper than anger ever could. The officers tried to defend themselves. "We were just following protocol," they argued. But the evidence made it clear. This wasn't just one mistake. It was years of the same pattern. As the review went deeper, the cracks began to show. Reports of missing body cam footage appeared. Videos labeled corrupted or never submitted at all. The officers sat stiff, their voices weaker now. One whispered, "We only did what we were taught." The man looked at them and replied softly, "Then maybe it's time we start teaching something else." His words carried more weight than any accusation. Finally, the board announced its decision. Both officers were suspended from duty. No cheers, no noise, just silence. The same silence that had followed the man since the day of his arrest, now resting on their shoulders. After the hearing, he didn't celebrate or boast. He quietly closed his binder and left the room. By the next morning, he was already traveling to another city, another case waiting. That was his role, not to seek revenge, but to make sure accountability existed where it had been missing. Back at the precinct, things began to shift. Training manuals were updated. Rookies were told to think before rushing, to check before cuffing, to see people as people first. Some past victims even received phone calls or apologies, small signs that the message had sunk in. The officers who once thought their badges made them untouchable now lived quiet lives, far away from the spotlight. And the lesson stayed behind. Real justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly with truth, patience, and the courage to hold up a mirror. That morning outside the bakery became more than just an arrest. It became a reminder that power without accountability always reaches its limit. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a vague description comes over the radio, someone will pause, ask a question, and choose to see a person instead of just a profile. At the station, the officers walked in with the same easy swagger they always carried after an arrest. To them, this was routine. They joked with the desk officer, sipping the last of their coffee, making light of how smooth the stop had been. They didn't bother checking the man's ID, didn't look at the pastry bag still marked with a receipt, didn't ask a single real question. To them, he was just another suspect, another name on a report they'd laugh about later. But the man wasn't like most suspects. He sat calmly in the holding area, his posture straight, his face steady. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't even ask why he was there. After several minutes, he simply looked at the officer on duty and said in a clear, firm voice, "I'd like to make a call." At first, they brushed him off. One officer smirked, "You'll get it after booking." But something in the man's tone made the desk officer hesitate. It wasn't pleading and it wasn't nervous. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask for permission. It expected the rules to be followed. Reluctantly, they handed him the phone. He didn't scroll through his contacts or fumble for a number. He dialed quickly as if he'd done this 100 times before. When the line connected, his words were sharp, direct, and professional. "This is Morrow, Boise PD, Madison Avenue incident. I'll need everything by this afternoon." Then he hung up. No wasted words. No explanations. The whole call took less than 30 seconds. The officers nearby laughed. "Attorney General's office, right? Tell him we said hi," one of them joked. But the desk officer wasn't laughing. He was staring at his screen, still pulling up the man's record. His hands froze over the keyboard. The name matched. The address matched. But the file wasn't like a normal file. It was flagged, restricted, connected to state systems he rarely saw. He glanced up at the man again, calm, composed, waiting. Something didn't add up. Meanwhile, in the hallway, the arresting officers leaned against the vending machine, treating it like any other day. "These guys always act important until the cuffs go on," one muttered, cracking open a soda. The other nodded, rolling her eyes. "He'll be out on bail, probably back to the same street corner by tomorrow." But in the holding cell, the man wasn't rattled. He sat still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes focused on the floor. The cold metal of the bench didn't seem to bother him. He wasn't pacing or muttering under his breath like others often did. His silence carried a weight that unsettled even the booking clerk. It was only when he spoke again, calm but firm, "I'll need my call documented," that the officer at the desk realized this wasn't just another man passing through. The words weren't a request, they were a record. The kind of thing someone says when they know people will follow up. By the time the paperwork slowly wound its way through the system, something behind the scenes had already shifted. A secure line had been opened. A quiet alert had been flagged. And while the arresting officers still laughed in the break room, thinking this was nothing more than another easy report, they had no idea that the ground beneath them had already started to move. Because the man in the holding cell wasn't powerless, and the silence they mistook for weakness was the very thing that would turn their world upside down. The hours after the arrest dragged on like any other shift for the officers. They filled out the bare minimum paperwork, laughed about how smooth the takedown had looked, and traded jokes about the man's calm expression. To them it was already over. Another name, another face forgotten as soon as the report was filed. But down at the booking desk things didn't feel routine. The clerk had double-checked the man's file 3 times, and each time the same thing happened. Instead of the usual criminal record or clean slate, the screen flashed with special access warnings, files tied to state departments and oversight offices. He leaned back in his chair uneasy. Something about this didn't sit right. By mid-afternoon, the quiet hum of the precinct was broken by the sound of a printer spitting out an urgent message. The desk officer grabbed it, read it once, then twice, his throat tightening. The order was short and direct. Release detainee immediately. Hold no further records. A state review is already underway. It carried a digital seal from the Civil Oversight Department. The arresting officers were called back inside. "What's this about?" one asked, frowning as the clerk slid the paper across the counter. "You can't be serious." "We caught him on a call. Fits the description, black jacket, loitering." The clerk didn't argue. He simply gestured to the paper. "This isn't from me. This is from above. Way above." Minutes later, the station doors opened and two officials in dark suits walked in. They weren't loud, they didn't flash badges dramatically, they didn't have to. Their presence alone made the room quieter. Without hesitation, they walked straight past the front desk, straight to the holding area, and greeted the man with a respectful nod. He stood, straightened his jacket, and followed them out as if nothing unusual had happened. The officers stood frozen as he passed. The man didn't glare at them, didn't smirk, didn't say a single word. He just walked with the same calm, steady pace he had outside the bakery, and somehow that silence weighed heavier than any insult he could have thrown. "Wait, what just happened?" one officer muttered under his breath, his eyes darting between his partner and the officials leading the man out. The other officer forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Probably some political nonsense. Some guy with connections. He'll get his slap on the wrist, maybe a fine. Happens all the time." But even as they said it, neither of them believed it. The desk clerk was still staring at his screen, watching files shift behind access walls he couldn't reach. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The whole precinct could feel the change in the air. By the time the man stepped out of the building, released without a single charge, whispers were already spreading. Names floated through the hallways, speculation building. Some said he was a lawyer. Others swore he was tied to the Attorney General's office. Nobody knew for sure, but one thing was certain. He wasn't just another man on the street corner. The arresting officers tried to brush it off. "We did our job," one muttered on the drive home, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. But deep down, both of them knew they'd made a mistake bigger than any they'd made before. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. The morning of the hearing, the two officers dressed in their sharpest uniforms. Their badges were polished, their boots shined, every crease in place. For them, court appearances were nothing new, just another part of the job. They walked into the courthouse side by side, chatting casually, convinced this would be over quickly. They expected the same old routine. The man would show up with a lawyer, maybe try to play the victim, and the judge would glance at the report, nod, and move on. They'd testify about probable cause, the man would get a mark on his record, and by lunchtime, it would be just another story they told over coffee. But the moment they stepped past security, something felt off. The hallways were busier than usual. People weren't just moving around like on a normal court day. They were gathering, whispering in corners. They noticed cameras too, not the usual tired local news guy, but full crew setting up tripods, adjusting lenses. One officer frowned. "Why's the press here?" "It's a stolen car call, nothing special." His partner shrugged, though she was starting to feel the same unease. When the bailiff called their names, they straightened up, shoulders back, and walked into courtroom 2C. And that's when their confidence cracked. The room wasn't filled with defendants waiting nervously for their names to be called. It wasn't the usual shuffle of public defenders flipping through overstuffed folders. The room was packed with city officials, reporters, even council members sitting quietly in the back row. Every eye turned when the officers walked in, but it wasn't admiration or respect. It was something colder, scrutiny, and then they saw him. At the front, seated beside the judge, wasn't a man waiting for trial. It was the very same man they had cuffed outside the bakery. He wasn't wearing jeans and a jacket this time. He was in a tailored suit, his binder neatly open in front of him. He didn't look up at them, didn't smirk, didn't even acknowledge their presence. He simply flipped a page, clicked his pen, and continued reading like he belonged there. In front of him sat a nameplate. It read clearly, "Special Counsel for Civil Accountability." The officers froze. One of them leaned in and whispered sharply, "This has to be a mistake." He was the suspect. The other swallowed hard. "Not today, he's not." The judge's voice cut through the tension. "This session will review the conduct of Officers Halcroft and Mercer regarding an arrest on Madison Avenue. Present with us today is Special Counsel Morrow, who will serve in an advisory role representing the state's Civil Accountability Office." The words hung heavy in the room. The officers shifted on their feet, their polished confidence slipping. They weren't here to testify against a criminal. They were here to answer for themselves. The man still didn't look at them. He calmly closed his binder, clicked his pen once more, and slid a document across the table to the judge. The sound of that single page moving seemed louder than anything in the room. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras zoomed in, council members exchanged looks. This wasn't just a case, it was a statement. One of the officers cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Your Honor, there must be some confusion. We were responding to a call." The judge cut him off. "You'll have your chance to explain. For now, sit and listen." The officers obeyed, but their legs felt heavier than ever. They sat stiffly, their badges gleaming under the courtroom lights, but for the first time those badges didn't feel like protection. They felt like targets. As the man in the suit adjusted his papers, finally glancing their way, the message was clear without him saying a word. This wasn't going to be routine. This was accountability. And the officers realized, too late, that the real trial had just begun. The hearing began quietly, but the silence carried weight. The judge opened the session, but it was the man in the suit who set the tone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't point fingers. He simply opened his binder and slid the first page forward. "Case 1, he said calmly. "A man stopped for a broken tail light. Detained for 45 minutes. No charges filed. No body cam footage submitted." He let the words sink in before continuing. "His name is Julian York. He left that stop with a sprained wrist. His complaint went unanswered." The officers stiffened. One of them spoke quickly. "That was years ago. We responded as trained." The man didn't even look up. Case 2. A father walking home from the store with his daughter, mistaken for a robbery suspect, thrown to the ground in front of her. Charges dropped. Report filed using the exact same phrasing as Case 1. The daughter's name was underlined in the file. The man tapped it once with his finger, then placed the page down. That child didn't speak for days after watching her father in handcuffs. "Tell me, does your training account for that?" The room went still. The press scribbled faster. The officers shifted in their seats. Case 3. Another sheet slid across the table. Identical language. Fit the description. Suspicious behavior. Non-compliant tone. Same officers. Same outcome. No charges. One of the officers leaned forward, his voice sharp, almost desperate. "We respond to calls as they come in. We don't control the descriptions dispatch gives us." Finally, the man looked up. His eyes were calm, steady. "But you control what happens after. You control whether you ask for ID. You control how long someone sits cuffed on a sidewalk. You control whether you listen or whether you assume." He reached into his binder again and pulled out a map. Red pins dotted neighborhoods across the city. "These are your stops from the past 5 years. Notice the clusters? The same streets. The same communities. Compare your record to 3 other patrol teams in this precinct. You average 42% more stops. 80% involve one demographic. 90% end without charges." He placed the map flat on the table, his voice still even. "That isn't policing. That's profiling." The officers sat rigid. Their mouths opened, then closed. No excuse fit the weight of the evidence. The man didn't stop there. One by one, witnesses entered the room. They weren't loud, they weren't theatrical. They spoke in steady voices about what had happened to them. A college student cuffed outside his dorm for lingering. A store clerk stopped on his way home from work, accused of casing the shop he'd just finished closing. A mother describing how her teenage son came home in tears after being searched without cause. The officers tried to keep their composure, but the stories chipped away at them. Not because they were shouted accusations, but because they were simple, human, and true. Each one matched the same pattern. Vague suspicion, no charges, quiet humiliation. When one man finished his testimony, he paused, looking directly at the officers. "I filed a complaint," he said softly. "I never heard back. Not once." The weight in the room grew heavier. The man in the suit clicked his pen once and closed his folder for the moment. "These stories are not accidents," he said. "They are choices, and choices repeated over years become patterns." He leaned back slightly, eyes steady on the officers. "This review isn't about a single morning outside a bakery. It's about every morning that came before it. The badge doesn't shield you from accountability. Not anymore." The judge glanced at the officers, then back to the counsel. "Proceed," she said. And for the first time since the arrest, the officers realized They weren't here to explain a mistake. They were here to face everything they thought no one would ever dig up. By the second day of the hearing, the officers walked in differently. Their steps weren't as sharp, their shoulders not as squared. The uniform still looked the same, polished, pressed, perfectly in line, but something had changed. The shine on their badges no longer felt like protection. It felt like a spotlight. The man in the suit sat at the same place, his binder neatly stacked, a pen resting beside him. He didn't look tired, he didn't look angry. He looked prepared, and that more than anything unsettled the room. The review board opened another folder. Over the last 24 months, one member read aloud, 3 body cam uploads have been reported as corrupted. 2 were never submitted at all. Each incident involved these same officers. The air in the room tightened. One of the officers leaned forward, his voice sharp, defensive. That's a tech issue. It's not on us if the files didn't process. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting. Once, maybe. Twice, perhaps. But the 4th time? That's not failure. That's a pattern. The words landed like a stone. The officer's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. His partner folded her arms tightly, staring at the table, her eyes fixed on a spot that didn't move. For the first time, neither had a comeback. Witnesses continued. Each one told their story plainly. No shouting, no dramatic pauses. And that made it worse. A man spoke of being shoved against his own car for asking for a supervisor. A mother described her teenage son being handcuffed on the sidewalk because he wore a hoodie, similar to a vague suspect description. Their stories weren't about one bad night. They were about a routine that repeated itself. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Their faces, once full of confidence, were now pale, strained, almost hollow. One finally broke the silence. You don't know what it's like to walk those streets every day. People lie, people run, people fight. You learn to read signs. The man in the suit nodded slightly, acknowledging the point. The job is hard. I won't deny that, but when the same kinds of faces are the ones always paying for other people's mistakes, it stops being about safety. It starts being about comfort. The comfort of predictable assumptions, the comfort of not checking twice because it's easier not to. The female officer let out a bitter scoff. We've only done what we were taught. The man looked at her steady. Then maybe it's time we start teaching something else. The room went silent. It wasn't anger that made his words sting. It was the truth in them. By the end of the session, the review board leaned forward with their decision. One member read it out carefully, every word like a slow nail being hammered in. Effective immediately, Officers Halcroft and Mercer are suspended from active duty. Their badges and weapons are to be surrendered. Pending further review, they will not return to field work. The officers sat motionless. No arguments. No protests. Not even whispers to each other. Just stillness. The man didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply closed his binder, stood and nodded politely to the board. For him, this wasn't a victory, it was a process. He left the room without another glance while the 2 officers sat in their seats, suddenly smaller than their uniforms. The silence that followed was heavier than any siren, heavier than the sound of a gavel. And in that silence, the truth settled. The badge had protected them for years. But today, it couldn't shield them from the very accountability they thought would never come. When the board's verdict was read, the courtroom didn't erupt. There were no cheers, no slammed fists, no loud reactions. Just silence. The kind of silence that says something important has shifted. The 2 officers remained seated, their polished badges suddenly stripped of meaning. For years, those badges had been their shield, their excuse, their protection. Now, with a few calm words and a binder full of truth, that shield had cracked. They didn't argue. They didn't storm out. They just sat still, staring at the floor, realizing their world had changed. The man in the suit gathered his things quietly. No smug smiles, no gloating. He didn't need to rub it in. His purpose wasn't revenge, it was accountability. He had come to show the truth, and he had done exactly that. As he walked out of the courtroom, reporters hurried to follow, but he didn't stop to give speeches. He didn't need the spotlight. The work wasn't about headlines. It was about structure, about change. Back at the precinct, the ripple effects began almost immediately. Training manuals were updated. Recruits were now asked new questions. Questions about judgment, about bias, about accountability. Role-play scenarios shifted from textbook examples to real cases pulled from the city's own history. Quietly, without press releases or parades, the culture began to bend. if only slightly. Some of the people who had once filed forgotten complaints started receiving calls. A man got an apology letter from the mayor's office. Another was invited to mediation, not because of a lawsuit, but because the city finally wanted to listen. They weren't grand gestures, but they mattered. As for the officers, their lives moved in different directions. One took a quiet desk job, far from patrol cars and flashing lights. The other left the state altogether, retreating into privacy. Neither spoke publicly about what happened. Neither wore the same confidence again. They had believed their badges made them untouchable, but the truth had proven otherwise. And the man? He didn't stay. He never intended to. A few days later, he was already in another city, another precinct, reviewing another case. That was his role. To move quietly from place to place, making sure no department forgot that accountability was watching. He didn't post about it, didn't seek applause. The work itself was enough. In Boise, the story slowly faded from the headlines. Life went on. The bakery reopened each morning. The courthouse steps filled with echoing footsteps, patrol cars rolled down familiar streets. But underneath, something had shifted. Officers now hesitated before cuffing someone who fit the description. Recruits learned that mistakes weren't just paperwork. They were people. And for those who paid attention, the memory of that case lived on like a quiet warning, because the real lesson wasn't about two officers losing their badges. It wasn't even about one man standing up to them. The lesson was bigger. It was about what happens when power goes unchecked, and how easy it is to stop seeing people as people. It was about how silence, patience, and truth can sometimes weigh more than anger ever could. That day outside the bakery could have happened to anyone, but it happened to someone who knew exactly what to do with it. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He simply held up a mirror and made the system look at itself. And for once, the system couldn't look away. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like a man in a suit walking out of a courtroom, leaving behind nothing but a folder full of names and the echo of accountability. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a vague call comes over the radio, someone will pause before acting. Someone will see a person instead of just a profile, and that small pause could change everything.